Number 10. Turtle impact. A man from Florida has been killed by a turtle. Yes, that's right, he was literally killed by a turtle. Things like this only happen in Florida, ladies and gentlemen. The turtle didn't actually go out of its way to kill this guy, though. Instead, the man hit it with his motorized bicycle while driving at night, flipping over his handlebars, and that's how he died. His name was David Curvin, 51 years old. He was discovered laying beside the road near his destroyed bicycle after he lost control from hitting the turtle. Local fire rescue crews responded to the scene, discovering David's body along with the body of the turtle. According to a spokesman from the Brevard County Fire Rescue, David suffered a head wound and was already dead by the time they arrived on the scene. As for the turtle, it managed to survive with a small crack at the bottom of its shell. Rescue workers said that when they arrived, it crawled away back into the wild with only minor injuries, but probably also a lot of street cred. The autopsy afterward showed that David suffered from head trauma consistent with what happens when a person falls off of their bike. It was an incredibly rare occurrence and one of the dumbest ways to die. Number 9. Danger in the Alps. Albert Dyrland was a Danish YouTuber who became a statistic after he perished by plummeting off the side of a mountain in the Italian Alps while trying to film a video for his channel. Albert fell to his death on July 28th. He'd been hiking with his friends when the accident occurred. It happened at about 5 o'clock at night when Albert fell 650 feet to his doom. But why did he fall? He was hiking in part of the Dolomites, a place known for its incredibly sharp cliffs and dangerously vertical walls. He was on a designated hiking route and trying to create adventurous content for his YouTube channel, which at the time of his death had over 170,000 subscribers. This guy also had 230,000 followers on Instagram. He made fun music videos and silly comedy sketches, but like so many other people who have died recently trying to make YouTube videos and capture crazy selfies, Albert lost his life due to his dedication to his cause. It's not exactly clear how he fell off the cliff, but we do know that he was trying to film a video when it happened. Chances are he got a little too close to the edge while trying to show off for his subscribers, and then slipped all the way down to the bottom of the mountain, where he broke open like an egg. Number 8. Peeing on a shark. A man has been killed at a beach in Brazil. He was killed when he got the brave idea to pee on a shark. Marcelo Rocha Santos was 51 years old. One day he was having fun and drinking with his friends when he realized he needed to go to the bathroom. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, so Marcelo decided to wade into the water to relieve himself, and then realized with great horror that he was literally peeing on an 8.5-foot tiger shark. And that shark really didn't appreciate the golden shower, so it attacked him. I mean, think about it from the shark's point of view. He was just minding his own business, checking out the fish, and then all of a sudden the water around him got really warm. That is gross. Come on, you'd be mad too. His friends on shore witnessed the entire thing, claiming that Marcelo was pulled underwater in a violent struggle that caused him to lose consciousness. Then the water was filled with blood. Even though Marcelo's friends jumped into the water and pulled him back to shore, it was already too late. He was bleeding, he had lost part of his arm, and a piece of his leg was also missing. He was rushed to the hospital and pronounced dead almost immediately. Now let this be a lesson to everyone. If you're at a Brazilian beach and feel the need to urinate, maybe find a bathroom or do it in a bush, not on a shark's head. Number 7. Elephant throwing stones. At a zoo in Morocco, an elephant has murdered a little girl. This is tragic and bizarre at the same time, and may be the only recorded incident in which an elephant literally committed murder. It happened at the Rabat Zoo, and to be honest, the elephant probably wasn't trying to kill the child at all. The thing is that the elephant picked up a rock with its trunk and threw it over its fence. That rock hit the little girl in the face and it killed her, and it didn't happen immediately. She was first taken to the hospital, but within just a few hours she was pronounced dead. The zoo made a public statement saying that the accident was rare and unpredictable and unusual. After all, elephants don't typically kill zoo visitors, never mind sniping small children with rocks. But here's what Phyllis Lee said, the scientific director of the Amboselli Trust for Elephants. Phyllis says that elephants don't generally throw stones, and even less do they throw things at a target. However, it can happen when elephants are bored or frustrated. The elephant was probably frustrated that it had nothing to do. It threw the rock in no particular direction, and the young girl just so happened to get bumped in the head. What's the craziest thing you've ever seen at a zoo? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 6. A Corvette in a pool. Two very unlucky people have died after driving a Corvette into a pool. And while this may seem like a pretty cool stunt, it's actually a pretty dumb way to die. It happened in a backyard in California. The car was speeding at 2 o'clock in the morning with the driver driving recklessly. The driver couldn't take the sharp turn that was coming up, and they ended up smashing through the median, skyrocketed through the air after flying over the curb, and then they landed in the pool. And it was a complete freak accident that there was a pool there at all. Unfortunately for the three people in the vehicle, the pool didn't offer much in the way of a cushy landing. A young girl was pronounced dead at the scene, only 21 years old, with a 27-year-old man being taken to the hospital and pronounced dead there. The third person was a 23-year-old female, and she managed to survive while suffering several serious injuries. They probably weren't wearing their seatbelts, and to be quite honest, there were probably a bit of drugs and alcohol involved as well. Number 5. Too much oxygen. Something very strange happened to a young boy named Michael Colombini. It was 2001, and the young boy needed to get an MRI. MRI is short for magnetic resonance imaging, but something went terribly wrong. A nurse walked into the room with Michael and the MRI machine when she wasn't supposed to. She was carrying an oxygen tank, which became attracted to the activated machine. It was pulled out of her hands and propelled like a missile straight into the circular opening of the MRI. It didn't stop until it smacked Michael in his head, where he lay sedated inside the machine being tested for a brain tumor. The oxygen tank hit him so hard that he died 2 days later from complications. In this case, it was definitely the nurse at fault. She should not have brought in that oxygen tank. The hospital immediately accepted responsibility and offered the family $1 million to settle quietly. They denied that money and took extensive litigation not only against the hospital, but also against 9 others involved, including doctors, a nurse, technicians, the MRI suite administration company, and the MRI manufacturer. The family made understandable claims for wrongful death, pre-death conscious pain and suffering, and punitive damages. And in the end, the family of the boy settled their claim with the hospital, the Winchester Medical Center in Valhalla, and were awarded $2.9 million as compensation. Number 4. Hiding in the wardrobe. This next dumb death goes all the way back to the year 1667. Back in the old days, they didn't really allow women to go to college. A girl named Elizabeth Spencer was the only woman at Corpus Christi College in the United Kingdom. She was the daughter of the college master, and she fell in love with one of the students, a young man named James Betts. But they had to keep their love a secret. They regularly had tea together in private. After all, this was the 1600s we're talking about. Affairs back then consisted of little more than tea and maybe a little bit of hand-holding. But here's where the death happened. Elizabeth's father walked in on their little tea time, and just before he opened the door, Elizabeth shoved James into her wardrobe to hide him. She then went away for a little bit with her father, and when she came back, she found that James had suffocated inside the wardrobe while she was gone. She had accidentally murdered the man that she loved, and as if one tragic death wasn't enough, Elizabeth was in such a fit of grief that she tossed herself from the roof of the college, and to this very day, the ghosts of Elizabeth and James are said to stalk those college halls. Number 3. Drowned in burning. A freak accident has killed a gardener. A businessman drowned in the river after he accidentally lit himself on fire. His name was John Lewis, and his body was discovered in the River Severn in England. But let's back up a bit here. Before John was found dead in the river, he was reported missing by his wife. According to the BBC, his wife had returned home to discover a burned lawnmower, pieces of John's burned clothing, and no trace of her husband. A search was launched, but it took 2 weeks of investigating for the police to finally find his body. They found his body completely naked except for his shoes and his socks, about 1.5 miles upstream. The police were able to put together that he had accidentally set his clothing on fire while trying to light a bonfire in his yard. To put the flames out, John jumped into the nearby river, but he couldn't swim very well. He struggled as he floated off down the river and eventually drowned. That poor guy. Number 2. Flying fire hydrant. Watch your heads. In Oakland, a man was killed by a flying fire hydrant. It happened early on a Thursday evening when the driver of an SUV lost control and struck the fire hydrant with such force that it was dislodged from the sidewalk and sent flying through the air. The fire hydrant weighed 200 pounds, and it hit Humberto Hernandez, a completely innocent 24-year-old bystander who had just been taking a stroll with his wife, right in the back of his head. The fire hydrant actually skipped off his skull and landed about 20 feet away. Hernandez had just purchased flowers and cherries for his wife, and they were on their way to a fancy restaurant. It was supposed to be a perfectly romantic night. But the Ford Escape driving up the street didn't care about anyone's romance. It blew a tire, swerved, and sent that fire hydrant sailing through the air on a path of destruction. Hernandez was pronounced dead at the scene. Eddie Bermudez, a motorcycle officer who investigated the death, said it was a 1,000,001 chance that something like this could even happen. The cop said if Hernandez had just been one step ahead or even one step behind where he was on the sidewalk, he wouldn't have got hit at all. Number 1. Drugging a hippo. Dr. Marcus Hoffmeyer is head of veterinary services at the famous Kruger National Park in Kenya, Africa. Back in October of last year, the doctor was conducting research on a unique chemical that was to be used for drugging hippopotamuses. The doctor and his team had so far tested the substance on 19 hippos, and all of them have been a success. But the 20th hippo proved to be a problem. After the doctor shot it with the tranquilizing dart, the animal freaked. Instead of falling over like all the other hippos, it rioted. It charged right for the doctor, knocking him over and nearly biting his entire head off with its huge hippo teeth. In fact, that hippo may have killed the doctor if he wasn't yanked out of the way in the nick of time by a researcher named Nico de Bruin, who thought quickly and saved that dog's life. A game ranger was on the scene and had to shoot and kill the hippo to save everyone else. It's regrettable that the hippo had to die, but for our safety's sake, he had to be shot. That poor hippo. After the terrifying incident that almost made the doctor lose his head, he claimed that the tranquilizer dart probably didn't pierce the hippo's thick skin, which is why it managed to stay awake. In this case, that extremely dumb death was averted, but it was definitely a close call.
10. Unlikely hero. At the Payne County Jail in Oklahoma, an unlikely hero saved a guard from almost being murdered by a crazy and hysterical inmate. The whole scene was captured thanks to the security cameras at the jail. The trouble began when a particularly violent inmate abruptly attacked the only officer in the room with a series of lightning-fast punches. The officer tried desperately to regain his composure, but the inmate just kept punching him right in the face. Ouch! The unlikely hero was sitting in a chair and silently watching the assault unfold, looking like he wasn't going to intervene at all. But when things looked like they might turn deadly for the officer, the inmate got up and came to the rescue. The hero inmate was significantly larger than the inmate that was beating up the officer. He literally picked the guy up from behind in a bear hug and flung him to the ground like a sack of potatoes. It took almost no effort for the bigger inmate to put down the attacker, and thanks to his intervention, the officer survived and was able to call for backup. According to Captain Kevin Woodward from the local sheriff's office, the incident only happened in the first place because they don't have enough funds to keep enough correctional officers at the facility. 9. Too hot to handle. 6 inmates were awarded shorter sentences after they came to the rescue and saved the life of one of the guards that was looking after them. A large group of prison inmates in Georgia were doing maintenance work at a local cemetery when the deputy sheriff guarding them suddenly collapsed. It was incredibly hot out that day, and apparently he couldn't handle the heat. He wasn't even attacked by anybody. It was the sun that almost killed him. But what makes the story so incredible is that when the officer lost consciousness and collapsed, the inmates could have easily run away and escaped. They could have taken the cop's gun, they could have driven away in the van. They may have even been able to cross the state line before anyone even took notice. But they didn't. Instead, the 6 men jumped into action and used the guard's cell phone to call 911. While one inmate was on the phone with the officer, another inmate removed the guard's bulletproof vest and tried to cool the officer down. Greg Williams, one of the inmates involved in the rescue, said it wasn't about who was in jail and who wasn't. It was about a man in need of help. Thanks to the brave inmate's quick thinking, the officer was rescued by paramedics and has made a full recovery. In return for their bravery, the sheriff recommended that all 6 inmates get reduced sentences. And in the meantime, the department even threw them in a pizza party. Now that's community service. 8. Jailhouse heart attack. Yet another group of inmates in Georgia saved a prison guard. What is it about Georgia? This time, though, it was during an almost fatal heart attack. The 3 inmates were at the Gwinnett County Jail when Deputy Warren Hobbs began to act a little strange. He suddenly fell to the floor, cracking his head on the concrete. The 3 prisoners were in their cells when they witnessed Warren have his heart attack. They did the only thing they could and raised an enormous ruckus. They started hollering, screaming, and banging as hard as they could on their doors to wake everyone up. Within seconds, the entire cell block was making noise. They made enough noise that the deputy rose from his heart attack stupor and hit the button that opened the cell doors. 3 of the inmates ran out and began performing what little first aid they could. One of the inmates even grabbed the deputy's phone and called for help. He ended up being rushed to the hospital and later fully recovered at home. We are deeply appreciative to these 3 inmates for the courage, determination, and kindness they displayed when they came to the rescue of our deputy, said the Gwinnett County Sheriff's Office. This just goes to show that just because you've made some bad choices that landed you behind bars doesn't necessarily mean you're an awful person all around. 7. Rikers Island Rumble. At Rikers Island, a brave group of inmates rescued a female corrections officer who was almost brutalized by a huge prisoner when they were locked inside of a vestibule together. An inmate had managed to slip inside an area that was supposed to be protected. The area was called A Station. He got through by slipping through a crack in the wall and then opening the security door. Inside the secured area was the female correction officer. It was just the 2 of them alone, with the inmate being a whopping 5'9", 1.7 meters, and weighing nearly 300 pounds, 136 kilograms. He immediately pulled down his pants and launched himself right on top of the surprised lady officer. Luckily for the correction deputy, a group of inmates saw what was happening and ran to her rescue. With brute force, they ripped apart the plexiglass separating them from the vestibule, then rushed inside and took down the inmate who was trying to force himself onto the guard. With the inmates in control, they kept the naughty inmate down until help could arrive. If not for them, things may have turned out very differently for the officer. What do you think should happen to the inmate that attacked? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. 6. Prison Break. In the state of Texas, a group of inmates broke out of their cells to save the life of a correction officer. Video footage of the amazing incident was recently released by the Park County Sheriff's Office. The inmates were being held in a minimum security holding room beneath the district court building. As they were waiting to be moved, the officer watching them suddenly slumped forward in his chair and grew unresponsive. At first, the inmates didn't really know what to do. They looked at the unresponsive guard through their holding cells, debating how they could help him. Finally, the inmates worked together to break open the cell door and run into the holding area, where they proceeded to check on the officer and bang on the doors for help. They shook him, trying to wake him up, but he had no pulse and wasn't breathing. One of the inmates grabbed his radio and called for assistance. In just minutes, other officers in the building realized something was terribly wrong and quickly called for the paramedics. The officer was resurrected with a defibrillator and stabilized, and all thanks to the kindness of the criminals. The officer that went unconscious said he absolutely credits the inmates with saving his life, especially considering it all happened in such a short amount of time. The inmates were then locked back into the cell with a thank you and no additional charges for escaping. They will still be processed for their previous offenses, which included drug charges and assault. 5. Alabama Scissor Attack. In Alabama, a female inmate who managed to get her hands on a pair of scissors has been charged with attempted murder. The charge may have been first-degree murder if not for 4 other inmates who intervened during the brutal attack at the Marshall County Jail. It all went down when Officer Melissa Woodall was escorting Emily Sledge from a holding cell to the main women's block so she could use the toilet. As they passed through a work cubicle on the way to the bathroom, Emily picked up a pair of scissors that she sneakily scavenged from one of the desks and then started stabbing the officer. But just as the officer was being stabbed, she managed to open the cell block door. Other inmates came streaming out of the cell block, and despite the fact that Emily was brandishing a bloody pair of scissors, they took the murderous girl down. In the end, the officer was taken to the hospital and treated for a stab wound in the arm and 4 stab wounds to the head. She is extremely lucky to still be alive. and her attacker will now be spending, presumably, the rest of her life behind bars. Did she really think she was going to get away with it? What do you think was her reasoning for stabbing the guard? 4. A reduced sentence. 31-year-old Antonio Dwayne Brown was sentenced to spend between 1.5 to 5 years imprisoned in Kent County, Michigan, after being charged with fleeing and eluding a police officer. Hours after Brown was sentenced, he saved the life of a female guard, turning things around for himself. The female guard was unlocking the prison system to let out another inmate who was being held with Brown. The other inmate was Willie Williams, who had requested to grab a roll of toilet paper. He was supposed to return to his cell after grabbing the roll, but instead he snuck behind a pillar and then attacked the female guard when she walked by. Williams knocked the radio out of the woman's hand, began beating her, and then got on top of her and started to choke her. But as he was attacking the guard, he accidentally touched a button on the wall that opened up the other cells in the area. That was when Antonio Brown charged the attacker and pulled Williams off the woman, just seconds before she would have been strangled to death. After everything calmed down, the judge called Brown back into the courtroom and gave him a greatly reduced sentence, awarding him for his good deed. Good job, Antonio. 3. Strangled with a towel. In Falkenberg Road Jail in Florida, the inmates will use just about anything as a weapon. One particularly creative prisoner recently tried to strangle a guard to death with a towel in a completely unprovoked attack. The attack was perpetrated by Zyandre Zachary, only 22 years old, who was serving a sentence for burglary. As Deputy D. Hernandez walked by, Keandre did a sneak attack from behind with a towel and tried to suffocate him. Luckily, the other inmates weren't quite so savage. They quickly ran to the aid of the guard and wrestled Keandre off him, managing to save the guard's life. After the incident, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office praised the inmates for their good behavior and said the rescue was due to the professionalism and mutual respect between the inmates and the guards. If the guards weren't so civil with the inmates, chances are they may not have intervened at all. The guard was okay, besides the neck abrasions and a twisted ankle. 2. Free pizza. 3 inmates were given free pizza after they saved the life of a detention officer from a brutal attack in North Carolina. As with many of the other attacks we talked about today, this one seemed completely unprovoked. As the detention officer walked through the cell block, an inmate named Daniel Bledsoe shoved him to the ground and started choking him. Immediately, without any thought of hesitation, 3 inmates jumped up and saved the officer from the attack. For their bravery, they were given pizza. As for the attacker, he already had a previous assault charge pending in an unrelated attack on a different detention officer. After this second incident, chances are he's going to be locked up a whole lot tighter. 1. Saved from a stroke. A group of inmates serving time at a Georgia jail have been praised as heroes after saving the life of Deputy Patrick Edmond, who nearly died from a stroke. The deputy had been conducting a cell search when some of the men noticed he was acting a little odd. His eyes were fuzzy, he wasn't behaving quite right, and he was mumbling the same phrase over and over again. Finally, he dropped a blanket that he'd been holding, staggered, and then nearly toppled over. One of the inmates grabbed him and helped him sit down in a chair, while the other inmates ran to the unit phone and called for help. As it turned out, the deputy was having a massive stroke. After medical personnel arrived and sent him to the hospital, he passed a blood clot in his brain. Luckily, doctors saved his life and sent him home to recover. But if it hadn't been for the help and quick thinking of the inmates, the stroke may have killed him right there in the prison. (10) The Ukrainian Skynliv disaster. The deadliest and one of the most tragic air show accidents in history happened on July 27, 2002. The catastrophe went down at the Skynliv airport in Ukraine. A Ukrainian Air Force Su-27 flanker plane was performing in the show, with thousands of people watching, when the pilot made a terrible error that ended up killing 77 people and injuring 543. Both of the pilots managed to eject safely and survive, but the consequences of their actions caused the biggest mass fatality event at an air show ever. The flanker was flying at low altitude, performing a sort of split S, and was descending very quickly towards the taxiway when the left wing hit a tree. This caused the plane to pretty much nosedive into the crowd of people on the ground. The plane hit the asphalt, then it dragged with it 4 rows of barbed wire fence, and then it exploded and cartwheeled into the spectators. In other words, it mowed down hundreds of people with a barbed wire fence like some kind of metal fishing net before turning into an out-of-control fireball and hitting the crowd. After the disaster, pilots claim that the airbase map they received was different from the actual layout they found at Scariest Airport. They also said they had been denied an extra rehearsal flight before the show, although later the cause of the crash was found in that the pilots violated the plan and performed maneuvers they had not done before. Other factors, including a small and inappropriate flying zone by the show organizers who had also allowed spectators to gather so close to the flight line, were to blame. The pilot, Volodymyr Topinar, stated the accident was because of technical problems and a faulty flight plan. All of these excuses didn't stop a military court from sentencing him to 14 years in jail. 9. The deadliest bird. In the small British Columbian town of Kamloops in Canada, a jet crashed into a house on May 7, 2020. The aircraft was a CT-114 Tudor, supposed to be part of an air show that was going on that day. However, just shortly after takeoff, a loud impact-like sound was heard and there was an accident, causing the pilot to dive straight into the house. An investigation revealed that the veteran pilot was foiled by none other than a bird. Yes, a single small bird hit the plane and caused it to spiral out of control, killing Captain Jen Casey and injuring the pilot, Richard McDougall. But how did a bird cause such a major accident? Apparently, it doesn't actually take that much to bring down a fighter jet. The investigation uncovered that a single bird flew directly into the engine of the aircraft, causing a compressor to halt and the plane to lose thrust. Because of the loss of power, the plane stalled and nosedived towards the ground. As for the house that the plane crashed into, nobody was injured. But boy, they were sure surprised when they got home. 8. Spitfire Hero. On June 4, 2001, in northern France, a 56-year-old pilot named Martin Sargent died immediately when his World War II fighter craft crashed into a field. The plane was seen flying with a trail of smoke shortly before it went down. This guy was a true hero. He was a father of 3 and a very experienced flyer, and it was thanks to his experience that he managed to save hundreds of people from getting killed as his plane plummeted towards the ground. It was shortly after takeoff that his Spitfire encountered difficulty. He knew that he needed to make an emergency landing. However, the emergency landing strip was full of spectators watching the air show. He knew the crowd could never disperse before he hit the runway. He had no other alternatives, so he swerved the plane out of the way at the last second, crashing into the field and dying in a huge ball of fire. He could have probably stuck the landing and saved himself, but it would have resulted in dozens, if not hundreds, of civilian injuries. He will be remembered as a true hero. 7. Coventry Air Crash. At the Coventry Classic Air Show in England, after a full hour of incredible aerial displays, the Spirit of St. Louis took to the sky. She was piloted by the experienced Swedish pilot Pierre Hollander. After the replica aircraft took off, it immediately experienced problems. The wings started to break up, and the aircraft plunged 100 feet, 30 meters, straight into the ground, shocking the audience at the Coventry Airport. Thousands of people who had been enjoying a day of thrills and spectacle fell silent as word spread that the replica of the Spirit of St. Louis had crashed out of the sky. It's a bit ironic because the pilot had built the replica himself. Obviously, he didn't do a very good job. The left wing suffered an immediate failure, folding back on itself. It didn't last more than 2 minutes in the air before it disintegrated and caused the plane to smash into the field. Nobody in the audience was killed, but the pilot was dead immediately upon impact. Have you ever seen an air show in person? What did you think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. 6. Moose Jaw Air Collision. Yet another Canadian air show ended in disaster back in 2005 when a pair of biplanes smashed into each other at the Saskatchewan Centennial Air Show. The pilots were part of an aerobatics team known as the Masters of Disaster. Well, unfortunately, they really lived up to their names. The two American stunt pilots were simulating a dogfight from World War I in their replica biplanes when they crashed head-on and turned into a pair of flying fireballs. The 20,000 people in attendance were beyond shocked. One of the witnesses told reporters afterwards that he had never heard so many people be so quiet at one time. At first, the spectators kind of thought it was just part of the show. It wasn't until emergency crews sped onto the scene and started spraying foam on the smoldering wreckage that the audience realized something terrible had happened. Both pilots were dead, burned alive in their cockpits. 5. Falling helicopter door. An accident at the Salt Hill Air Show in Galway, Ireland, left 3 people seriously injured when a helicopter door fell from the sky and landed in the middle of the unsuspecting crowd. The door belonged to an RAF Merlin helicopter. Spectators were just relaxing and hanging out on the beach watching the show when the helicopter passed over them. Eyewitnesses saw the helicopter hovering over a nearby hotel when the side door simply detached and began falling. One Polish man was crushed by the door, along with 2 women. All 3 had simply been watching the show on the beach. The helicopter door fell from roughly 150 feet, 45 meters, hitting the spectators like a cartoon anvil. A photographer who was capturing the event from the top of a hotel, Liam McBurney, said panic erupted as about 100 people scattered from the shoreline. The door fell off and was just like a piece of paper floating in the wind, he said. It floated over the promenade and crashed into the beach before bouncing about 5 to 10 feet into the air and landing again. The injured spectators were taken immediately to the nearest hospital and discharged shortly after. Their injuries weren't fatal by any means, but it was still pretty terrible. It's just lucky that only the door fell out of the sky, not the entire helicopter. The authorities promised to launch an investigation to see how the incident occurred, though nothing has been found out yet. 4. Deadly biplane. A former British Air Force biplane fell out of the sky and collided with parked cars just minutes after taking off from the Brimpton Airfield in Berkshire, the United Kingdom. It was all part of an air show being put on for charity. The biplane left the runway, was airborne for a handful of seconds, and then fell directly into a group of parked cars, injuring a 60-year-old woman who needed to be airlifted to the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxfordshire. The irony here is that the hospital the woman was taken to was the very thing that the charity was raising funds for. The biplane was a silver Tiger Moth, roughly 100 years old. Both the pilots managed to crawl out of the crashed aircraft without any serious injuries. Apparently, the vehicle was too old and too unreliable to even be flying in the first place. But to make matters worse, they weren't even trying to pull off any crazy maneuvers. The charity event wasn't technically an air show. The vintage aircrafts were simply taking off from the runway and then landing again. 3. The Galloping Ghost. The P-51, nicknamed the Galloping Ghost, was responsible for one of the most devastating crashes in airshow history. The 1940s aircraft was piloted by Jimmy Leeward at the Reno Air Races in 2011. Back in its day, it functioned as a bomber escort and ground strike aircraft that could fly at incredible speeds of over 360 miles per hour, 580 kilometers per hour. It had been modified as an air racing vehicle to maintain a speed of roughly 500 miles per hour, 804 kilometers per hour. As you can imagine, a vintage aircraft flying this fast is bound to be a little dangerous. During the race, Jimmy lost control. According to pit crew member Andy Chiavetti, Jimmy hit somewhere around 22.5 Gs, an incredible force that no pilot can handle no matter how much experience they have. The crushing force basically incapacitated Jimmy so that he could no longer control the plane. He was too fast and too high. But this proved to be a major problem because the plane was out of control and the engine was still going full speed. The Galloping Ghost rolled over at max speed, then plummeted towards the ground at the spectators like a rocket, going around 400 miles per hour, 644 kilometers per hour. It crashed in the second worst possible place, at the spectators' stand. The only way the accident could have been worse is if the plane crashed just a few feet forward, directly hitting the stands. If that had been the case, the death toll would have been significantly higher. Out of the 7,500 people watching, 11 of them were killed, including the pilot, and 69 more were injured. It became the third deadliest air disaster in U.S. history. 2. Breaking the sound barrier. In 1952, thousands of spectators were watching a de Havilland 110 aircraft break the sound barrier. The aircraft was piloted by John Deary, who 4 years prior became the first British pilot to ever break the sound barrier. He was extremely experienced and knew exactly what he was doing. Still, that didn't stop his aircraft from disintegrating in the sky above the surprised spectators and then raining down to earth like hellfire. 31 people were killed in the incident, along with the pilot. Dozens more were wounded and quickly taken to the hospital. But how did the incident happen? John had just completed his supersonic dive and was trying to straighten himself up. He botched the maneuver. As the nose came up, the aircraft broke apart. Both engines flew out of the fuselages, with one crashing into a parking lot and the other smacking down on a hill filled with people watching the show with such intense force that bodies were literally thrown into the air. 1. Biggin Hill crash. At the Biggin Hill Airport outside of London in 1980, a Douglas A-26 Invader crashed and killed 7 people. The aircraft was part of a display reenacting the Battle of Britain. On board the aircraft, which was developed for the U.S. Army Air Force around 1943, were 6 passengers and the pilot. The plane was attempting to carry out a barrel roll when something went wrong, and it inverted and then dived into the ground, smashing into the valley near the end of the runway. It was very far from the screaming spectators, so luckily there were no casualties, other than the people inside the Douglas A-26. But unfortunately for everyone inside, they met a pretty miserable end. Everyone in the aircraft died, which actually prompted the Civil Aviation Authority to restrict passengers during air shows. After this, nobody other than the pilot and co-pilot were allowed to be in airplanes during public displays. As for why the Douglas A-26 crashed, that is still a mystery to this very day. The airplane was inspected before takeoff and found to be running properly with both engines in perfect shape. It was most likely a pilot error. Maybe one of the passengers got a little too rambunctious and caused the pilot to make a fatal mistake. Would you dare attend an air show after hearing these horrifying stories? Let us know in the comments section down below, and thanks so much for watching. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and come back for more awesome videos. See you next time. Bye.